absolute nothingness, while to form describes the action of organizing, restoring, or putting in order. Therefore, the first verse presents the creation of the totality, while the rest of the chapter describes a reorganization that starts from a ruined state. By observing this distinction, the ancient creation emerges with clearer outlines. God does not do incomplete works, does not start projects that need to be corrected immediately afterward, and does not establish a world in darkness only to adjust it later. Every act of God is born in perfection. This understanding opens space for a deeper look at the first earth. Imagine this world functioning in full harmony. It would have been structured with balance, sustained by the presence of God, endowed with purpose, and organized in perfect cycles. The Bible never portrays God creating anything imperfect, and this truth becomes one of the pillars for understanding what would come next. The initial creation, therefore, cannot be confused with the state described in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Since this state is linked to darkness, deep waters, and absence of form, elements that are not compatible with the nature of the Creator. The phrase, "the earth was without form and void," can be translated as "the earth became without form and void," an expression that points to transformation, not origin. And this aligns with other passages, such as Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23, where the prophet describes a devastated land using exactly the same words, not as initial creation, but as a consequence of judgment. This biblical parallelism strengthens the idea that between the first verse and the second there is an interval, a space where something happened. Not an invented gap, but a silence that carries an event that Scripture does not narrate directly, but leaves enough signs to be perceived. This first earth, created in perfection, is not mentioned again because its history does not belong to humanity. It exists before the formation of Adam, before the creation of Eden, before the divine breath transformed dust into life. The biblical account begins to detail the human experience only from the reorganization of the already devastated earth. Humanity did not witness this previous creation, but it leaves marks within the text itself, marks that appear as clues, not as explicit statements. If God created everything in order, then what caused the state described in the second verse? This question is not answered directly in the text, but the junction of passages, principles, and theological coherence indicates that it was not God who introduced the disorder. Chaos is not born of Him. Darkness is not His work. The absence of form is not the result of His creation. Something happened between the initial perfection and the devastated scenario that opens the narrative of the recreation. And this understanding becomes the key to comprehending the entire continuity of history. The first earth does not appear as an empty scenario, but as a finished work. The initial verse does not describe the formation of the world from water and darkness, because none of that existed at that moment. This state arises later. What is created perfect does not become desolate without reason. When the Spirit of God begins to hover over the waters, He is not inaugurating creation, but preparing the ground to restore what had been hit by a profound and silent event, which the text does not detail, but which the biblical sequence allows us to identify. All of this leads to the understanding that something broke the order of the first creation and plunged the earth into darkness. The Bible presents enough traces to understand that this event does not belong to the human world, but is linked to the history of spiritual beings, a history prior to humanity, and which establishes the backdrop for the chaotic state seen at the beginning of the recreation narrative. The first creation, therefore, functions as the basis that precedes an event that radically changed the structure of the earth, creating the scenario for God's next work, which would begin with the moving of the Spirit over the waters while something greater awaited to be revealed in the sequence. The first earth was already established in order when Lucifer appears in the biblical narrative as one of the most impressive figures among created beings. The prophet Ezekiel describes this anointed cherub with details that reveal the greatness he possessed before the fall. In Ezekiel chapter 28 verses 13 to 15, Scripture states that he was in Eden, that he was created with perfection, that he was adorned with precious stones, and that his entire structure had been prepared on the day he was formed. These words do not describe a common being, but someone who occupied a position of authority, someone who carried beauty, strength, and responsibility within the order established by God. Lucifer's presence within the ancient creation was not accidental. He was placed in a strategic position, established as the covering cherub, a function that required proximity to divine glory and direct involvement in the spiritual government that existed before humanity. Isaiah chapter 14 verses 12 through 14 reveals that his function was not only aesthetic but hierarchical, pointing to his influence over regions and structures established by God. The expression morning star used by Isaiah demonstrates that he reflected light and occupied an elevated post among the celestial beings. This authority is manifested in the biblical text not only by the description of his appearance, but by the language that indicates governance. When Scripture says that he walked among the stones of fire and that he had been placed on the holy mountain of God, it points to an environment of leadership, where his decisions influenced the functioning of this pre-Adamic creation. There are no elements that indicate this environment was figurative, as the entire narrative of the chapter emphasizes the reality of his position and the seriousness of the function entrusted to him. Lucifer moved in the midst of this perfection, as someone who had freedom and responsibility. He was blameless in his ways, as verse 15 declares, until iniquity was found in him. This statement becomes crucial for understanding his role in the ancient creation. Evil did not arise as part of the initial configuration, nor as a structural failure. It appeared within the heart of someone who had received authority and beauty. This indicates that within this creation there was order, but also freedom, and this freedom was used in a distorted way by a being who was supposed to reflect the glory of God. The glory he possessed was not just visual. The Bible describes that instruments and sounds had been prepared in him since the day he was created. This suggests influence over worship, communication, and spiritual expression within the established order. His action probably involved leadership over other beings, moving structures and orienting functions, since the expression anointed cherub that covers is applied to someone who covers, protects, sustains, and exercises authority. None of this suggests human or terrestrial, but points to detailed and intentional spiritual organization within the previous creation. At this point, it is important to realize that Lucifer's presence in this creation is not presented in a secondary way. He was an indispensable part of the structure created by God to reflect his order and glory. The ancient creation had purpose, structure, and spiritual leadership, and he was central to that functioning. The Bible does not mention other details about this environment, but the verses describing Lucifer make it clear that his position required direct responsibility over what functioned before humanity arose. This ancient world had government, and this government involved spiritual beings who exercised functions within the perfection established by God. But the integrity mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 28 did not remain. The text declares that iniquity was found in him, and this iniquity did not arise from outside. It was born from within him. The phrase, "your heart was lifted up because of your beauty," shows that his own glory became the reason for his fall. The ancient creation, which had been formed in order, was then touched by an element that did not exist until that moment, a deviation that became the seed of all subsequent conflict. This internal change occurred while he still occupied the elevated position that had been given to him. He did not fall because God humiliated him, nor because others betrayed him, but because he desired more than what had been entrusted to him. His heart sought to rise above the stars of God, sought to establish his throne, sought to take for himself glory that did not belong to him. These declarations, in Isaiah chapter 14, reveal the internal path that led to his fall. None of this depends on metaphors, for Scripture itself presents these thoughts as real and direct, marking the exact point at which the ancient creation began to feel the effects of corruption. This deviation did not just impact Lucifer. The position he occupied means that his change affected entire structures. The ancient creation, once organized, experienced spiritual rupture beginning with this iniquity. The fall was not merely a personal fall, but a breakdown of government, a breakdown of order, a breakdown of harmony. His influence reached other spiritual beings, and what began as pride expanded into rebellion, transforming into a movement that would affect the entire environment that God had established. The pre-Adamic world had no relation to man, but was connected to the spiritual sphere that preceded Eden. Within this context, Lucifer became primarily responsible for the rupture that would pave the way for even greater events. The change that occurred in him created a shadow over the creation that previously reflected light, and this shadow began to alter the spiritual order that had functioned perfectly until then. The ancient creation would be directly impacted by the expansion of this rebellion that was beginning to form, setting the stage for a conflict that would reach proportions greater than any being of that order could imagine, while everything silently progressed towards the next unfolding. The rupture that began within Lucifer did not remain limited to his interior. The position he occupied allowed his influence to reach other spiritual beings, and what was born as pride transformed into an organized movement against the order established by God. The Bible describes in Revelation chapter 12 verses 7-9 that there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought with his. This reference does not point to a conflict created by human beings, but to a previous confrontation, where the ancient spiritual creation found itself divided between submission and rebellion. The rebellion did not happen impulsively. It formed gradually while Lucifer nourished thoughts that Isaiah chapter 14 records clearly. He said in his heart that he would ascend into heaven, exalt his throne above the stars of God, and sit on the mount of the congregation. These declarations reveal the intention to take for himself what had not been given to him. The movement that began as vanity transformed into ambition, and this ambition became a plan. The spiritual order that once functioned in perfect obedience now had within it a leader who summoned followers. Scripture does not detail how many beings were attracted by this influence, but it clearly states that his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, language that points to the adhesion of many angels to the rebellion. They were not deceived by lack of understanding, but decided to follow the one who wished to establish a parallel dominion. This group becomes the nucleus of the first spiritual war recorded by the Bible, a conflict that does not occur in the human environment, but in the spiritual sphere that existed before humanity was created. The war described in Revelation chapter 12 does not arise as a metaphor or an illustrative figure. It demonstrates a real confrontation between two sides, each representing opposing principles. Michael, identified as a spiritual prince in Daniel chapter 10, assumes leadership of the faithful part, while Lucifer, now identified as the dragon, leads those who chose rebellion. This clash marks the point where the ancient creation experiences its first great conflict, not between natural forces, but between spiritual forces that previously coexisted in harmony. This war is not described in human terms, because it does not involve physical weapons or geographical territories. It is a struggle for authority, for government, for submission to the Creator. The ancient spiritual creation becomes the stage for this confrontation, where every being is faced with the choice between remaining faithful to God or following the one who sought to usurp a throne that never belonged to him. The conflict is not born because of the earth, but it directly affects the spiritual structure that was linked to the previous creation. The action of Michael and his angels demonstrates that God did not allow the rebellion to advance without a response. Scripture states that they prevailed against Lucifer and his followers. This declaration points to a full victory, not a partial one. The text says that their place was no longer found in heaven, and this removal represents a direct consequence of the rebellion. The spiritual environment in which they dwelled could no longer be the same, because the order had been broken and evil had been found among those who should reflect obedience. This expulsion is not merely displacement, but judgment. The group that decided to follow the rebellion was cast into another sphere, removed from the original position they occupied. The ancient spiritual order could not be restored while these beings continued to exert influence. Their fall creates a rupture greater than any spiritual being could imagine, a rupture that does not only affect heaven, but affects the ancient creation that was under the spiritual responsibility of that hierarchy. The impact of this conflict on the ancient creation can be perceived by the drastic change seen in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. The earth became without form, void, covered by deep waters and shrouded in darkness. This state does not represent initial creation, but a consequence of something that destroyed the previous order. The judgment that would come after this war directly affects the pre-Adamic world, creating an environment completely different from the one established in the beginning. The ancient creation collapses, and this destruction is aligned with God's judgment upon the rebellion that had arisen among the spiritual beings. The war was not fought for material resources, but for spiritual authority, and Lucifer's defeat established the basis for everything that would follow. His fall paved the way for judgment